Hello Dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 5 Part 1, the Constitutional Convention. The main idea behind this civics lesson is delegates to the Constitutional Convention faced many issues. Debate and compromise led to the decisions made in writing the United States Constitution. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you will be able to explain how the delegates organized the Constitutional Convention, summarize Madison's plan for the new government, summarize the debate over how power would be shared by state and national governments, describe the compromises that were made about representation in Congress, and explain the major elements of the executive and judicial branches created by the Constitution. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. Shays' rebellion raised doubts in the minds of many Americans about the young government under the Articles of Confederation. With no power to tax or to enforce laws, Congress seemed almost powerless to deal with the country's debts or to settle disputes between the states. Therefore, in 1787, Congress approved a convention for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Even before the convention began, most delegates agreed that a national government was needed, not just an alliance of states. Also, they recognized the need to guard against abuse of power. Many delegates agreed with Montesquieu's principle of separation of powers among three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. In addition, they agreed that the government's power must be limited by dividing power between the states and the national government. Despite these areas of agreement, the delegates were sharply divided on other important questions, such as how many representatives each state should have in the national government and how much power the government should be given. As the delegates packed their bags and left for Philadelphia, they braced themselves for a long convention. The site of the Constitutional Convention was the Pennsylvania State House, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed in July of 1776. Summer in Philadelphia meant heat, humidity, and flies. Thomas Jefferson is said to have joked that the Declaration was signed quickly because flies were biting the signers. Actually, the Declaration had been signed only after long, heated debate, and the Convention of 1787 promised more of the same. On Friday, May 25th, the business of the convention began with the unanimous selection of George Washington as the presiding officer. However, the delegates realized that it would take more than Washington's popularity to keep the convention on course. Without clear rules, the meeting could end in confusion, and the young country might fall apart. Several of the rules the convention adopted were aimed at keeping the discussions secret. It was feared that if the debates were reported in the newspapers, delegates would not feel free to change their minds or to consider the common good of all the states rather than just the narrow interests of people back home. With these concerns in mind, they decided that no one should remove notes from the meeting room. They also agreed that conversations about the proceedings should take place only inside the State House, and that doors and windows were to be kept shut at all times. Other rules covered voting procedures and behavior during meetings. Each state had one vote, regardless of its number of delegates. The debate rules allowed for each person's opinion to be heard. No one was to whisper, pass notes, or read while another delegate was speaking. The delegates met 6 days a week from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. without stopping for a meal. They also met with each other before and after the formal sessions. Although some of the 55 delegates left Philadelphia for brief times, an average of 40 were present on any given day. As one of their first acts, the delegates voted not to revise the Articles of Confederation. Most of them believed that government under the Articles was so ineffective that a new plan was needed. Few delegates, though, had specific ideas about how to organize the new government. One person who did have some definite ideas was Virginia's James Madison, who proposed a framework for a strong national government with legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The legislative branch would have two parts: a House of Representatives, and a Senate. Members of the House would be elected directly by the people. Senators would be chosen by members of the House. The number of seats in the House and Senate would be based on each state's population. Madison's proposal, known as the Virginia Plan, dominated discussion for the entire convention. Madison was calling for an alliance of independent states to be replaced by a strong national government. Many of the delegates, however, feared that under Madison's plan the national government would be too strong, snatching away important powers of the state legislatures. The states had become used to controlling all their own affairs. Many delegates feared that a strong national government might abuse its powers, treating the states in much the same way that England had treated the colonies. Throughout much of the long, hot summer, delegates argued over how power would be shared between the national government and the states. One issue was whether each state would have the power to either protect or abolish the slave trade. Several northern states wanted the national government to regulate all trade and to outlaw slavery. The southern states objected to this proposal because their plantations depended upon slave labor. Eventually, the delegates compromised because they saw the urgent need to form a new government. They agreed that the national government could regulate trade in general, but that it could not interfere with the slave trade until 1808. Some delegates hoped that a national government might end slavery at a later time, but first that national government had to be created. Eventually, the delegates decided which powers would be given to the national government, which would be kept by the states, and which would be shared by both. Reaching agreement on the powers of the national government was only part of the struggle. The delegates also had to decide how that government would be organized. Since the core of a representative government is the legislature, the delegates focused mainly on issues relating to representation in Congress. The major question was how many representatives each state would have in the legislature. In Madison's Virginia Plan, each state's population would determine the number of its representatives. Objecting that they would always be outvoted by the large states, the small states supported a different plan proposed by William Paterson of New Jersey. Known as the New Jersey Plan, it called for a one-house legislature in which each state would have an equal number of votes. As supporters of each plan argued back and forth, tempers flared in the June heat. The convention seemed to be going nowhere. Realizing that they were making no progress, the delegates considered a plan proposed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Like the Virginia plan, it called for a bicameral or two-house legislature. The House of Representatives would be elected on the basis of state population. In the Senate, however, each state would have 2 senators, regardless of its population. This plan gave the large states more power in the House of Representatives, but each state had equal power in the Senate. Although no one was completely satisfied with Sherman's plan, the delegates finally approved it by the narrow margin of 1 vote. The plan became known as the Great Compromise because each side gave up part of what it wanted in order to benefit all. If both sides had been unwilling to give and take, the convention probably would have failed. Although they had argued over the number of representatives, most of the delegates agreed that a 2-house legislature was a good idea. It would help ensure that fair laws were passed because each proposed law would have to be approved by both houses. Jefferson, who was out of the country serving as ambassador to France, later reportedly asked Washington why the delegates had established a Senate in addition to a House of Representatives. Washington is said to have replied by asking, "Why do you pour coffee into a saucer?" "To cool it," Jefferson answered. Washington replied, "Even so, we pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it." The Great Compromise kept the convention alive, but it did not settle the question of how to count state populations when determining representation in the House. Although slaves were treated as property, the southern states wanted to count each slave as a person when figuring state populations. The northern states objected that this would give the southern states more members in the House of Representatives and therefore more power. Once again, the delegates compromised. They agreed to count each slave as 3/5 of a person when a state's population was calculated. As you may recall, under the Articles of Confederation there had been no executive branch to enforce the laws and no judicial branch to interpret the laws. The delegates agreed that these branches would be needed to provide for separation of powers. The delegates decided that executive power should be given to one president rather than to a committee of leaders. They broadly defined the powers and duties of the president. In establishing the judicial branch, they created a Supreme Court that would have authority to interpret laws and would thus be able to settle conflicts between different states. Although there was a general agreement on the functions of each branch of government, the delegates argued about who should elect the president and the members of Congress. Should they be chosen by all citizens or just by the members of the state legislatures? Some delegates argued for direct election by the citizens because it would take into account the opinions of a wide variety of people. Madison said, "The people at large were the fittest in itself." Many delegates, however, distrusted the people's judgment. Roger Sherman stated that average citizens will never be sufficiently informed. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts declared that the people were easily swayed and not very thoughtful. As part of the Great Compromise, the delegates decided that all eligible citizens, that is, white men with property, would elect members of the House, but state legislatures would elect senators. The delegates determined that a group of electors known as the Electoral College would select the president. Each state legislature would determine how the state's electors would be chosen. In mid-September, the convention finally drew to a close, with 39 delegates signing the Constitution on September 17, 1787. Benjamin Franklin was impressed that the debate and the compromises had produced such a strong plan. On the final day of the convention, he stated, "Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." The delegates to the Constitutional Convention are often called the framers, because they framed, or shaped, our form of government. Over the years, changes have been made in the Constitution, as the framers expected there would be. However, if they could see their work today, they would still recognize the basic plan of government they created over 200 years ago. So that's the way it is with Lesson 5, Part 1, the Constitutional Convention. At this point, you should know that the United States Constitution is a document made up of compromises regarding government power, and the system of government created under the Constitution established legislative, executive, and judicial branches and divided power between a national government and state governments. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of civics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons. See ya!